round. Pardon me. Mr. Brock, you have the floor for 5 minutes, please.
Okay. Thank you, Chair. I didn't think I had to use some of my 5 minutes to educate some Liberal members on your particular role as an Auditor General. You're not criminal investigators. You've never been set up as a criminal investigator. So your ability to detect potential fraud or other acts of criminality in relation to what has transpired under the SDTC is not your mandate. Just like the Ethics Commissioner. If it's blatant, if there's an abundance of evidence, as you've indicated, you can make that referral. But the fact of the matter remains, despite the best efforts of Mr. Erskine Smith, the RCMP have confirmed an ongoing investigation. Whether or not they ask for a production order from your office remains to be seen. But the fact that they haven't doesn't necessarily mean that they won't. And I think that's the message that needs to come through to Canadians watching this. It is an ongoing investigation. They've also confirmed that they've received documents from the House of Commons in relation to the House order, but they've been heavily redacted, which is precisely why government and the House of Commons has come to this gridlock because of government's failure to produce all unredacted documents to the House, which can then be used by the RCMP as they see fit. Whether they look at it or not, that's entirely up to them. But in relation to the potential criminality here, Madam Auditor General, and I want to remind Canadians, we're talking about potential fraud and breach of trust. Fraud is defined in the Criminal Code under Section 380 as follows: everyone who by deceit, falsehood, or other fraudulent means, whether or not it is a false pretense, defrauds the public or any person of any property, money, or valuable security, is then guilty of an indictable offense, depending on the value. Redirecting taxpayer funds to the tune of almost $400 million outside of contribution agreements, outside of the law, is in its very nature a fraudulent act. Whether or not the Crown can produce and establish intent remains to be seen. But the police will investigate at a lower standard than the Crown prosecutor who prosecutes potential fraudulent actors in relation to this scam. Let's not forget that the Assistant Deputy Minister, Mr. McConaughey, equated this to simply giving away free money. It was the equivalent of a sponsorship-type scandal. That is how massive this scam, this fraud, this crisis, this issue that is now bogging down the government operations in the House. To ask you one final question, all of this could go away if the government simply complied with the order of the House and released all the documents pursuant to that order. Would you agree with that, Madam Auditor General?
I think, as I've previously said, this dispute between the government and Parliament is one they need to answer for and they need to resolve. I am, complying to the best of my abilities with the order, but ultimately the information resides and is owned by the government.
Simple. This is hypothetical. If the government continues to refuse to release the documents, we have continued deadlock. If the government complies with the order, we can get back to the business of doing government. It's a binary option. It's a binary choice. Would you agree with that? The options the government has, comply or not comply.
Again, I think that it's up to the government to answer for why they are redacting or treating the information the way they are.
Right. Okay. Now to Mr. Ramey. Have you been contacted by the RCMP?
Mr. Chair, I have not been contacted by the RCMP.
Has anyone at SDTC been contacted by the RCMP?
Mr. Chair, as far as I'm aware, no one at SDTC has been contacted by the RCMP.
How about the current board members?
Mr. Chair, as far as I'm aware, none of the current board members have been contacted by the RCMP.
Okay. And I think you've indicated this, Auditor General. I want to confirm again, you've had some conversations you've indicated with the RCMP, but they have not directly asked for anything specific. Is that correct? Or asked for any further interviews with you? Is that accurate?
You are correct. We do speak to them on many files, but on this file, we've had regular conversation and we have not received a production order.
Thank you. I'm afraid things off. Mr. Perkins, you have the floor for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This round, I'll be posing the questions to the Auditor General and your team, if that's okay. In your opening statement, you mentioned that the documents that you have in the government's production order, all documents that departments have. So, in essence, those departments can and should be turning those over as part of the production order. Is that correct?
We have documents from many different entities, but the bulk of what we have in our file is either from the Foundation or Innovation, Science and Economic Development Canada. And so, yes, the Parliament should be receiving government information from the government.
And most of those documents, as I understand it, there's over 10,000 pages that have been redacted, not complying with the order. And ISED is still going through the documents. They've done a couple rounds. I got others. But the order came, as I understand it, from reading the law clerk's letters. The order came from the Privy Council office to say to filter the responses through the Privacy Act and the Access to Information Act, which were not part of the House's order, which is why we're at the stalemate right now, where the government could produce the documents unredacted, because it didn't say redact them or filter them through these acts. They could provide it and get on with the stalemate. So could you tell me who in the Privy, as a recipient, your office as a recipient of that direction from the Privy Council office, who in the Privy Council office wrote that letter?
So I have received absolutely no direction from anyone at the Privy Council office. My desire to comply with the government security policy, which is a requirement of my act, means that I have to go to ISED and say, you own this information. How are you treating it? I think that this dispute between the government and Parliament is one where the government needs to answer for why it is refusing to hand over or redact information. As I used the analogy before, I'm a caboose on this bus. I need to sort of let them go first, then I need to ask them to help me treat the information they gave me in the same way, because it is their information that I'm handing over, not my information.
So they're communicating to you to redact documents in a way that was not part of the House order, I would assume, primarily through ISED and SDTC, who are both on the list from the law clerk as censoring the documents.
So they are not communicating to me. I have been trying to communicate with them to get assistance. As I mentioned, we've had about a dozen conversations. I don't know, Andrew, if you wanted to add more, but it's really up to them to tell us what they're doing to the documents.
Yes, since June, we've had about 12 conversations with ISED officials to figure out the protocol as to how to treat these documents. We will end up getting direction from ISED, but as you mentioned, that's going to be on the basis of the decisions that they have made on those documents.
Which ISED officials could you table the list with the committee?
So the main contact is the Chief Executive Audit.
Pardon me?
The Chief Executive Audit.
The Chief Auditor.
The Chief Audit Executive, sorry.
For the department.
Yeah, for
Thank
the
you.
department.
You're aware that the Privacy Act, which was cited as a reason to exempt or redact these contract or these documents, Section 8 says that authorized bodies are exempted who have the power to redact documents, Section 8 of the Privacy Act. In fact, I think the Auditor General's Act has a similar provision. It says if you're an authorized body to order documents has that power, they're exempted from the Privacy Act. Are you aware of that?
So I will give Andrew the option if he wants to jump in. So when I received a request from this committee to hand over additional information about the 90 cases of conflicts of interest, I actually had a conversation with the Privacy Commissioner about, I think it's 82M, the clause. It's in the Privacy Act. It is not in the Auditor General Act. And I explored with him what it meant, the will of Parliament, and then it is up to me as the head of the organization to weigh whether the will of Parliament supersedes an individual's right to privacy. That's basically what 82M is asking for. When I looked at most of the information I provided, it is information that you can provide, you can find in the public domain, and hence I provided that table to the committee and cited that letter. But I also felt it important
I'm just short on time.
to tell. I also felt it important to let everyone know that I was handing over that
So
information.
in your opening statement, you acknowledged, as everyone does, the 400-plus year right of Parliament to ask for documents, and if they're unredacted, they're unredacted. That's a long-standing parliamentary right. Is it not true that this whole thing that has frozen the House is related to the fact that the Liberal government, has chosen to ignore the order of the House, which was voted on by a majority of MPs representing a majority of Canadians? 3 parties, not just one party, voted for these
Thank you,
documents.
Mr. Perkins.
Is it not true they could avoid it by just releasing the documents?
I'll allow an answer to move on.
Yes, thank you very much. I think what you're bringing up is the nature of the dispute that's between the government and Parliament. We've characterized it as a dispute. Quite frankly, for us, we feel like we're in the middle of this, but it's really the government that should be accountable for the decisions to redact or refuse to provide documents.
Thank you very much. Mr.
Thank you
Andrew,
very much.
you have the
That
floor
is
for
the time.
Mr. Cooper, you have 5 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. To the Auditor General, Ms. Hogan, just for the record, to be clear, you're not a lawyer, police investigator, or an expert to determine whether there was a conspiracy to commit fraud or those types of matters, correct?
You're correct. I am a CPA.
Okay, thank you very much for that. And I would submit that further underscores why it's necessary for the government to turn over all of the documents to the RCMP instead of continuing to obstruct Parliament, and instead of trying to use you as a shield to say, well, where was the criminal intent, when you don't look at criminal intent, correct?
Our audit isn't designed to uncover intent or fraud. However, when we do find something that we believe might be potentially fraud or criminal in nature, we would refer that to law enforcement.
I'm going to turn my next set of questions to Mr. Rami. Mr. Rami, with respect to the seed funding stream, it's correct that in order to receive funding under that stream, an applicant needed an accelerator to nominate them, right?
Mr. Chair, in that process, we partnered with over, I believe, 80 accelerators from across the country.
No question that an accelerator
and that
would need to nominate them, correct?
that is correct. And
Okay.
we would open a round and accelerators would nominate.
So who at SDTC determined the roster of accelerators that would recommend projects under this funding stream?
That funding stream would have, it was our ecosystems team that ran that funding stream and would have reached out across the country to onboard accelerators.
2 of the accelerators that were on that accredited list were Mars and the Verscheren Center, correct?
Mr. Chair, that is correct.
And we know that Annette Verscheren sat on the board of both Mars and the Verscheren Center. Did anyone raise any concerns about this, to your knowledge?
Mr. Chair, not to my knowledge.
So here we have a situation where there are 2 accelerators connected to Annette Verscheren, and these accelerators get to hand-pick projects to be considered for seed funding, funding that is approved by the SDTC board the board that Ms. Verscheren was the chair of, and it turns out that eligible expenses under the seed funding stream include the very services that these accelerators provide for a fee. That was the finding of the ethics commissioner in his report with respect to the Verscheren Center. How was that allowed to happen?
Mr. Chair, the report of the ethics commissioner is very clear. I don't have anything to add to his conclusions.
It's a total racket, and again underscores the mismanagement and corruption and conflict at SDTC. To Ms. Hogan, is it correct that in your report you found that it was not assessed by the board or by the department whether the $38.5 million in COVID payments that went out the door complied with the contribution agreements?
The fact that the COVID payments were lumped together and in a bulk approval, I believe they were actually in the consent agenda item, which typically doesn't even have a discussion or conversation at a board meeting. That did not follow the requirements of the contribution agreement. The Parliament clearly laid out that funding should always be provided to an organization on a case-by-case decision, and that was not the case here.
We have $38.5 million that improperly went out the door. Mr. Rami, what steps have been taken by SDTC, the current interim board and interim executive team, to recover $38.5 million tax dollars that improperly went out the door?
Mr. Chair, as I said in the previous round of questioning, the board is currently reviewing all of the eligible projects, including these payments, and they will, as they go through that review process, will then take the appropriate actions that's necessary, whether it's resuming funding, terminating funding.
$38.5 million went improperly out the door, and your answer is that up until now, nothing has been done to recover those funds. That is $38.5 million. What about the $220,000 that went to Annette Verscheren's company in which she was found guilty by the ethics commissioner? I asked a month ago when two interim board members appeared here, they couldn't answer what steps had been taken to recover those monies. Has anything happened since, or has the board continued to be AWOL when it comes to making taxpayers whole?
Mr. Chair, that process is ongoing, and when the board of directors...
Thank you, Mr. Cooper. That is the time. I appreciate it.